Samson and Delilah is one of the most iconic stories of the Old Testament. And I think it's something that just speaks to almost a universal experience of human nature. And that's why it's so compelling. I did a little bit of a search just for that kind of seductress, femme fatale, a siren kind of woman in other texts and other cultures, right? So like where else do you see in, say, other religions and other cultures and stories, like this kind of narrative where you have this woman so blatantly trying to tempt someone to their own destruction? Of course, it's again a common human experience, but really in terms of narratives, like a story that's intended to be an historical account of something that actually happened, and we believe that this is history. It's not just a myth or a tale, but this actually happened. There's actually not many early kinds of stories. This is maybe one of the earliest narrative accounts of this seductress coming and wooing a man to his own destruction. You do have other myths and things like that of Ishtar and other kind of mythological characters, but we are here talking about two people in a very human way, not in like a supernatural, goddess kind of way, of two people, and it's all so relatable. What I want to do is make sure that we catch the seductiveness of temptation and sin. On the other hand, I mean, you can get so drawn into that you forget what maybe God is doing or the picture that God is painting as a whole. And as we talked about this morning, when we're in the book of Judges, one of the lessons that we're trying to learn is, in fact, that all of these judges in some way have been imperfect. Now, maybe, there's some judges where just as like one sentence, like, this guy judged for 12 years and it doesn't say anything about him. Maybe they were perfect. I doubt it, right? Because when you read of these other men, like Samson and then like Jephthah and Gideon, you see that they're not perfect judges, that they fail. And God is really trying to demonstrate that there is no one who's ever walked the planet, save for one, who's ever been worthy of all authority and power. No one has been totally trustworthy. There's not been a pastor or a politician who's ever been just completely without temptation, without sin, that you can put all of your absolute hope and trust in. There just hasn't been anyone ever like that. We got to remember that that's sort of the big picture story that's happening here, even as we kind of dive into the nature of Samson's own life and temptation and try to avoid some of his mistakes. We don't want to miss that as God is being very descriptive here to describe very real people who are very really unqualified to be a perfect king or judge or ruler. And the only way we could have such a perfect king, judge, or ruler is if, in fact, that person was God himself. And so these things are always pointing to Jesus, always pointing to God himself having to come to us as a man and be our perfect, the perfect man, the perfect king, the perfect judge, and the perfect one to have all authority. So, Judges chapter 16, this comes after Samson has judged Israel for 20 years. That's what was said in the last verse of chapter 15. He judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. If you remember last time, he killed 1,000 or struck down 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. Do you remember that story? And so now he has been a judge for 20 years, but it's referred to as being in the days of the Philistines, meaning unlike the other judges where they would completely destroy or humiliate the oppressors, and Israel would have peace and prosperity. Here, there's still like a shadow. The Philistines are still casting a shadow somehow over Israel, and it's a relative peace. It's not a perfect peace. It's just they're kind of coexisting, and there hasn't been too much trouble. Now, commentators get very, very imaginative about what did Samson do for 20 years? Like, what was his condition? Because we've read stories of Samson so far, and he's sort of a very brash young man. He's very immature. He sees something and he takes it, follows his lust. He just seems like a young man that's kind of foolish, like many young men are. So commentators think, well, those 20 years, did he reform? Did he start doing the right thing for 20 years? And then chapter 16 with Delilah, that's just a misstep. He was doing very well and then he just made this mistake. Or was he the same old Samson that whole time? The same kind of very immature, a very impetuous, very impulsive guy that just, does it, but God kind of held him back a little bit, or maybe he judged that way for 20 years. So, right, there's a lot of imagination that you can put into that. Did Samson just was so busy, he didn't have time to fall into temptation and sin. He's so busy judging Israel that he didn't have a moment to spare in order to fall into sin, and so he kept kind of clean that way. Maybe he had a midlife crisis. Like, commentators go all over the place trying to figure out what he did for 20 years. Like, is chapter 16 something out of character? Or was Samson still the same old Samson for 20 years? Because it changes how you would preach it, right? If he was doing great for 20 years, he reformed, he repented of his previous life, and as he was a judge, he was doing everything right in the eyes of God. He was, remember, under the Nazirite vow, so he was actually living it up, and then he screwed up at the end. Or is it that, he was just the same old guy? And for 20 years, he just persisted in the same old guy until God wanted to humble him, right? It preaches differently depending on what he did in those 20 years. You know what the bottom line is? We don't know. We don't know how he was. We don't know whether this is, hey, watch out for the midlife crisis, because at this point he's maybe in his 40s, like around my age. Or even when you've overcome a sin, it can come back in a moment of weakness. Maybe that's all an application. Everything I just said, maybe those are all valid ways to look at it, because, quite honestly, in the realm of human experience and sin, those have all been true. There have been people, Christians, who seem to have reformed, they came into Christianity with some great sin that they finally overcame, and then they had freedom from that sin for 20 years, and then they stumbled again. Has that happened in the churches? Of course that's happened. Have you had situations where someone just really wrestles with a sin, but is wrestling with it and kind of does okay, but then some temptation comes along and he falls into it? Has that ever happened before? Of course. So whatever the case might be, it's not anything that is outside of what has happened to many a saint throughout the ages. The warning is still the same about sin, though. You've never arrived to a place where you don't need to be vigilant, watchful, careful about sin and temptation. Judges 16, Samson, after 20 years, went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites were told, Samson has come here. And they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, let us wait till the light of the morning, then we will kill him. But Samson lay till midnight. And at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. That's interesting, of course. You see the word Gaza there, and that's a place that's still in the modern news, right? This is taking place 3,000 plus years ago, and referring to a location that's still even now is relevant. I mean, it's just kind of interesting, isn't it? But Gaza, and you now probably know where that is because of the news even now, that little strip of land was historically the place where the Philistines dwelt. Now, there's no Philistines there right now. People in Gaza right now are mainly Arab. But at that time, it's kind of a Philistine stronghold in Gaza, possibly even like a capital city. So, what business does Samson have in Gaza? Hebron is like 40 miles away. So when it says that he took the gates and carried them, he carried it 40 miles, which is quite a hike, especially with doors and gates on your back. But what is he even doing there? He is their enemy. And he just seems to be walking into the town, and they know him, even though they're deep in Philistine territory, they know enough to be afraid of him. They know enough to be concerned about him and to try and ambush him. So they know who he is. He clearly knows who they are. They are enemies to each other. Why is he even there? Again, the text is not very clear. I mean, maybe he's just there to rub it in their faces, show that he can just walk through their city and have no fear because he is unstoppable. Or maybe this was kind of a secret meeting with a harlot, a prostitute. Whatever the case is, there's nothing good or noble about the circumstances of him being there. He didn't need to be in Gaza to shop for clothing or food. He didn't need to be there because he had some business dealings. He was a judge of Israel. He had no business to be there unless it was to fight a battle or a war, as he had done 20 years prior. So whatever the case is, and again, commentators are not sure, was this a chance meeting with the harlot or a planned meeting? All we know is that there's no good reason for him to be there. And we see again, Samson, a man of impulsiveness, given to temptation. He is in defiance once more. After 20 years, he's in defiance again of God's moral law against fornication, that is, to sleep with someone, not your wife. He's contradicting God's law to take a foreign woman into bed and to fraternize with a pagan nation and their gods. So for a judge, and for someone under a Nazirite vow especially, this is complete rebellion. Complete rebellion against who he is supposed to be. It's so opposite and opposed to the kind of man he was called to be. And it's deliberate. However you cut it, whatever his motivation was, it was a deliberate offense to God. Why did he get there? You want to know what he did for 20 years. Was he good or was he bad? Or just sort of somewhere in the middle? All we know is that he blatantly goes to Gaza, gets himself into trouble. Now, they set an ambush for him at night. This is a little bit of a guess based on what putting the gate of the doors on his back, is that they're waiting for night to ambush. And nighttime is a good time to do an ambush, but they also knew they couldn't defeat him hand-to-hand combat because he had killed a bunch of them with a jawbone of a donkey. That surely was a story passed on. And so my guess is they're going to try to shoot him with archers, from the wall. Just get up there and set up an ambush. And if they didn't catch him, like in a room, when he tried to leave, you just shoot him with arrows. Well, he rips out, these very, very heavy doors and gates and puts it on his back. Archers would not have been able to shoot him, and just like a turtle, right? Just walking right out the front gate. This is telling us again that even in the heart of Philistine territory, even after 20 years of maybe relative peace, they knew who Samson was. They knew his exploits and they knew his deeds. But I doubt they knew his God. And that's some of the trouble here. They knew about Samson and they're terrified of him, but they're not terrified of his God. They're not terrified of Yahweh as the one who is truly the one who gives empowerment to Samson. So, in any case, it's dark. He's got basically a huge wooden shield on his back, and he just walks 40 miles to this hill in Hebron. And this is just raw physical power, of course, to do that. And certainly it's divinely given power. I mean, no one can do this on their own strength. But again, there's no mention of the Holy Spirit here. And we talked about this last time, that it's sometimes when the Holy Spirit comes upon him, we know we need to pay attention. Does that mean that every time, though, he does something that requires that great strength and it doesn't mention the Holy Spirit? Is that something God approves of or doesn't approve of because the Holy Spirit's not on him? I don't know that there's a real pattern from it, but we do know that no one could have done this without God's strength. Now, there's a classic hypocrisy that's going on here with Samson and this prostitute. From the outside, Samson, he has his long hair, and that again demonstrates He's under the Nazirite vow. Remember, the Nazirite vow was a special vow you could make where you're committing yourself especially to God. Think of it like when you fast. It's a special kind of fast where you don't have any food from the vine, which would include wine and liquor. You couldn't have cut your hair, so his hair was very long, and you couldn't touch any dead thing. Remember, those are the kind of the three major aspects of the Nazirite vow. On the outside, you might think that because of his long hair, oh, he's a Nazirite. He's got this unique role. You might see him carrying this big, heavy, wooden gate and its doors and its poles on his back and think, well, of course, this is a mighty deed that can only be explained by God's hand, holding him up. Who would not guess that this was a righteous man? God's man. That's what you would say. If you just happened to be on the road, you saw the hair, you saw that he's carrying it, you'd be impressed. You'd say, boy, this is someone special. If you knew anything about the Nazirite vow, you'd say, this guy's not a Philistine. He must be Hebrew. Look at his hair. There's something going on there. Like, you would look on the outside and say, clearly, then, he must be God's man, special man, righteous man, appointed man. And yet, many a Christian, many a pastor might appear externally, on the outside, to be church-going, faithful men, mighty in the power of the Lord. Their ministry is exploding. God is blessing every step that they take, it seems, and every decision seems to be the right call. But such a man could still lack humility, could still be harboring sin or hiding something that he is doing wrong. Now, I'm not saying that pastors or Christians can be perfect or that we should judge every person who seems to be outwardly blessed by God. You can't take either extreme, just be totally disappointed that no one is perfect and give up, or to just constantly, well, if it seems to be going good on the outside, you must be hiding something. We don't need to be either. Only that we should be first suspicious of our own hearts. Just think about it. You can look on the outside like you're a good, righteous person. You can come to church and people look at you and say, I wish I had their life. I wish I had their walk with the Lord and all these things. And that person could be one of the, least spiritual, least holy people. Could be a Judas. And,
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. So you have to be suspicious of your own heart. And also never to be so taken by another person who seems so externally righteous and good that you don't see their faults or are not willing to see their faults, ask questions about how they're doing really, or hold them accountable. Some of the reason that we have church is not so that we just have another place where we have to fake it and pretend like we're good people. Church should be at least one of the few places in your life where you feel like, if I'm not perfect, I can tell someone, or someone's going to see it, and they're going to love on me, and they're going to encourage me, or they're going to rebuke me, but they're going to try to help me in some way. How can we avoid that kind of only being externally righteous, only kind of looking good? One commentator, Pastor David Guzik, he says, this is a great point. Samson did what we nearly all do when deceived by sin. He put his life into categories and figured that some categories God cared about and some categories God did not care about. Understanding that Jesus has claim over our entire life is a radical change of perspective. Now, have you done that? That's one way you can start being this kind of person that is outside kind of righteous and good, on the inside is not, that kind of hypocritical person. One way we do that is, well, God cares more about this than this. And so if I just make sure I'm going to church, people will not care as much what I do on Friday nights when I go out and get drunk or something. So as long as at church I'm there and I'm faithful and I'm singing on the praise team or whatever, maybe they won't care as much, and God doesn't really care about as much as what I do for a few hours on a Friday night. You start to make these categories, things God cares a lot about, things God only cares a little about. Guess what? God cares about it all. He cares, he's sovereign over it all, like we said this morning. Well, after this, we come now to Delilah. After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Again, the classic tale of seduction. Pride coming before the fall, which that's a phrase that comes from the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 16:18, Proverbs 18:12. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says this in the same vein, so it's not just the Old Testament, but this one, when I came across this reference, I sort of forgot this was in the Bible, or this was in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, "Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall." So if you think you're standing and doing okay, be careful. Pride comes before the fall. And there is few greater egos in the Bible than Samson. The valley of Sorek is on that border between Israel and the Philistine country. We saw something similar back with Samson and his first wife, he liked to play things close to the border. Like physically, he liked to be on the edge, right, of his territory, between the clean and the unclean, between the Hebrews and the filthy Philistines. He liked to be on the edge of that border. And so it was morally too. He liked to play along the edges. He liked to get very close. He wanted to know the temptation he needed to avoid. Like, how do I know how to avoid temptation unless I see it real close and know, oh yeah, I should avoid that. And it's that kind of thing that is the very nature of temptation that pulls you to the line. See how close I can get to it without getting over it. Well, you know what happens when you play that game? So often you step over it. Now, it is interesting that it says here, Samson loved this woman. Remember his first wife? He saw her, and it was lust at first sight, we said. No mention of love. I love this woman, go get her for me. No mention of love to his parents. No mention of love when he got upset that she was given to another man. No mention of love when he sought revenge after she was basically murdered. No mention of love in any of those. But Delilah he loves. Now, so often love is conflated with feelings and not conviction. It's very interesting that it says that he loved her, and we know that this love is wrong. And this is the problem with the idea that somehow loving something makes it right, as if loving someone in and of itself is so pure that it cannot be criticized. So in the name of love, husbands cheat on their wives with a coworker. Why? I love the coworker. So if it's love, it must be good, it must be pure, it must be holy. How dare you judge me? In the name of love, a woman can marry another woman. Or a man can have 3 wives because I love all 3 of them. And you can't criticize love. How dare you? Love is pure. Love wins. Love is love. In the name of love, a person can marry an animal or a robot because love itself is this idol and a god. This is the modern conception of love. It's a god that can sanctify and purify all that it touches. Right? Love has become this idol. You cannot criticize when someone says love. Now you cannot blaspheme. It's blasphemous to suggest that love has any definition or boundary, and that it doesn't make immediately something good and holy and sanctified. But you can love someone, right? You know this, and it can be absolutely wrong in the eyes of God, as is the case here. Right? It is absolutely wrong. Just because he loved her did not make this any better. You can love someone and it be absolutely wrong. And we need to understand God is love. And God is eternal and limitless. And so, yes, love is eternal and without limit in that sense. Yet love cannot be something God is not. God does have definitions and qualities to him. In other words, there are some things God is and some things God is not. And therefore, there are some things that love is and some things that love is not. And so there are ungodly things outside of God's design, character, purpose, and plan. And so there is love. There are kinds of love that are ungodly and outside of God's design, character, purpose, and plan. Because God is love. Some things do not honor him. And so there are some kinds of love and definitions of love that do not honor God, even though God's love is eternal and limitless, and love is eternal and limitless and powerful and wonderful, and yet it's not just whatever you make it either, just like God is not whatever you make of God. Love doesn't sanctify us or our thoughts. God sanctifies our love. When we grow in him, we start to love the things that honor him and reflect his nature. And unfortunately, so often love is, we just think of it as a feeling, a desire that we have. The heart wants what it wants. Paul Washer says, you need to preach the scriptures to your heart and stop letting your heart preach to you. And then he says, tell your heart to shut up. That's good advice. God is the one who sanctifies our thoughts about love. Love is not the thing that sanctifies our thoughts. And we see how much of a betrayal will befall Samson because of this wrong kind of love. His love for Delilah is going to be weaponized. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound that one could subdue you. Samson's love is pitted against Delilah's wiles. She is offered money by the lords of the Philistines to betray Samson. They want to humble him, which means torture and humiliation, as we'll see. But we also know that God wants to humble Samson as well. This isn't only about the Philistines humbling Samson. This is also about God humbling Samson. And the Philistines and Delilah are going to be God's instruments to both humble Samson, but what we will see, spoiler alert, is also God is going to use their scheme here to humble themselves. All in one. God is going to use Delilah's deception to humble Samson, but it's also going to cause the Philistines to be humbled when Samson brings a roof down over all their heads. Now, this is a classic scandal. Money and sex. It doesn't get any more classic than money and sex, right? There's a reason this story has a universal appeal and is well known, because it happens all the time. This sort of thing happens all the time. And again, this one might be even one of the most original kinds of historical accounts of that classic sex and money scandal. But you can read it in almost any day of the week if you read any kind of politics or news. Sex and money, money and sex. It's almost boring, right? Sadly, that seems to be what makes the world go round. And the Bible's very, it's not like squeamish to talk about that or reveal that as well. It comes up all the time in the Bible. These are two great temptations of ours as human beings, that desire for sex and that desire for stuff. We think that's what makes someone great. But as you know, the path to greatness is the opposite. It's not to hoard money, it's to give it. It's not to use your body to fulfill its own desires, but to spend your body and your strength in the service of others. It's the complete opposite. Now, not that sex is bad. Not that money is evil either. Neither is evil in and of itself, but the pursuit of them taints so much. Now, I find it interesting that she just goes along with it without hesitation, it seems. She immediately goes to Samson to ask him about this. In other words, does Delilah love Samson? No. This is kind of heartbreaking. When we get to the betrayal, I actually feel bad for him. We'll get to that in a minute, but she obviously doesn't love him, at all. It's sad. Anyway, we'll get there in a second. So, Samson, what does Samson say? Tell me the secret of your strength. Tell me how it is that someone could subdue you. Now, this might just seem like banter. Obviously, she doesn't say anything because I know some guys that want to capture you. I mean, this might be just playful in Samson's mind, like, she's just teasing him and wants to know. And so Samson, maybe he's trying to deliberately mock her. Maybe it's just kind of playing around, just, as people do, as husband and wife do. But he says to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Bowstrings in that day are likely was made of animal tendons and sinew. When I prepare messages, now I'm so thankful for YouTube. I looked up how do you make bowstrings, some ancient way. And so you can watch. I think they're called boyers. Yes, that's a nice tambourine.
It's purple.
Yeah, it's purple. Hey, Ziki.
I got it from the Tableau room.
Yeah, from the Tableau room? Okay. Well, you can play that next time. You can play with me the next time. It's okay. That's okay. So... It's fine. I don't ever want him to be afraid to come talk to me, so. We should just attach that to his belt so we always know where he is. That'd be helpful. So, I watched this whole YouTube video on a guy making, a bowstring from sinews and tendons and think, I'm going to get some great insight in this passage. Not really. I mean, it's really fascinating to watch because, we use nylon and all these polymers and things, but you can make bowstrings out of sinew and tendon, but it looked pretty tough even when it was, wet. So I don't know what this means if they were. So again, I know I keep referring to some commentators. It just, this story is so fascinating, it attracts a lot of attention from pastors, because pastors love preaching this text. And so you get a lot of opinions about this, but then when you get to other passages, it's nothing. They say nothing about these other passages. So they key on and everything. These bowstrings, if they were not dried yet and still wet, they would be more easy to break. And try to make some kind of significance out of that. I don't know. I think it'd still be pretty tough to break out of, at least me. I don't know that it matters dried or not. I think what Samson is doing is just trying to make it sound a little bit mystical. Achilles, his weak spot is his heel, and there's kind of a mythology to that, and it's kind of a mystical thing, why his whole body is his heel, and it's because that's where, some God dipped him into this, river, and he gained immortality except for that one spot. And there's a real weird story. So, this is a pagan nation, and maybe he's just kind of appealing to her pagan kind of ideas, and there's this thing that, where if I'm bound by 7 bowstrings that have not been dried, that'll really do me in. Of course, that doesn't work. Next, she asks again, Delilah said to Samson, verse 13, until now you have mocked me. Verse 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. So they're lying in ambush. He does not know that they're there, by the way, yet. So as far as he knows, his wife is either just trying to be funny or, just screwing around. She wants to know some secret of his, and if you've been married and you've been coy about revealing some secret, whether embarrassing or not, you can imagine the banter. So I don't know that he thinks anything of it. that she is actively trying to betray him. Now, I think he should have. I think he should have known something was up. But I don't think, at least until this point, that he's really accepted that she is really trying to kill him. Then Delilah said to Samson, verse 13, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web, and she made them tight with the pin, and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. Now, basically, just imagine that, she knit his hair together and tried to tie it into itself and into some kind of loom. It is, again, sort of a ridiculous kind of thing to do or to tell her. He is messing with her when he's doing this. Now, 3 different times, 3 different lies, the same outcome. And at this point, Samson is either too proud or too dumb to see that this is something beyond simple curiosity for Delilah. And I thought, that's the kind of blindness that love induces, right? Pride and stupidity all wrapped up into itself. Especially this kind of wrong love. When someone is, I see it a lot, unfortunately, as a pastor, is people either start to sleep together or live together before they're married, or they want to date like a non-Christian or unbeliever. And it's this amazing combination of like pride and blindness, pride and stupidity. Like, you can't judge, I've heard this, you can't judge me, you can't tell me what to do. Again, the love is, how can it be so wrong? God is love, I love this person, how can it be wrong for me to do this? Cheat on a spouse or something? And it's pride, right? But it's also dumb, like, come on, you know that this is wrong. You don't have to be some brilliant theologian to know that the Bible condemns this. You're not ignorant, and you know that this is going to ruin your marriage, or this is going to mess up your future with this person, possibly. If you marrying an unbeliever, it can be great harm. You know that. People know that going into it as a believer, but pride and stupidity. So I don't know which one it is for Samson. Maybe it is both, but he's not getting it. Either too proud or too stubborn to think that this is going to amount to anything, or is just so Twitter-pated with Delilah. He's blind and ignorant, willfully so, to what she is doing here. And so we have a face-off between Samson's stubbornness or stupidity and Delilah's seduction. Here she says, at the 4th time, she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up again, for he has told me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that Yahweh had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. She deploys some classic tactics. Question his love, play the victim, nag him to death. Proverbs, there's a few Proverbs that are relevant here. This is not, no, maybe I shouldn't I will just let the scripture speak. I won't give any disclaimers here, but Proverbs 21, verse 9 says this. It is better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. Verse 19, it is better to live in a desert land than with a quarrelsome and fretful woman. There is something to say here about the ability Delilah has to break the strong man, right? Samson is like the strong man of the Bible in terms of just raw physical strength. But how is he broken? Is mentally, psychologically, spiritually, by her gaslighting, you could say, questioning his love, playing the victim, and just nagging him to death. In the battle between his pride and her persistence, she wins. She won. There's a lot of parallels between Delilah and Samson's first wife, who's not even named, if you remember in Judges 13. Judges 14. Delilah is like her, except turned up to 11. So when we think of the kind of attributes, because remember, she also, Samson had this riddle, and then she kept pestering him to get the answer to the riddle. So it's very similar. There's a lot of similarities between the two, but Delilah is like extra in those categories. Now, this is not a misogynistic, women-hating kind of statement, as if all women are vixens or all women are nags. It's not what the Bible is trying to say, is that all women are like this, or even those proverbs are suggesting that all women are somehow seductresses or quarrelsome. Rather, this is a statement about Samson and his taste in women, because he picked two women that are kind of similar in this way. Samson chooses sensual women based on his sensual lusts. And unsurprisingly, both he and they are of poor character. When you choose people based on lust and temptation, you're not choosing out of sensibility and wisdom and good character. So what's the likelihood that the person you're choosing is going to be a wise, godly woman or man of good character if your basis for choosing is not from the point of view of a wise, godly, perspective? And so this is saying something about Samson, that he keeps picking women like this. Not necessarily that all women are like this. It's about Samson. Now Delilah wins, as I said, and he tells her the truth. And she knows it. What's heartbreaking here, as I was saying a little bit ago, if there's a moment where you might pity Samson, it's here, when she finally betrays him. Because the text is clear that she knew Samson well enough to know that he had opened his heart to her. She knew that she had broken Samson. She knew that he had told her the truth and his heart was open to her. And he was comfortable enough and trusting enough to fall asleep in her lap. I don't know, maybe it is, again, just stupidity or blindness, but I think that Samson, this was the only person in the world that probably knew Samson this well. Let's say it that way, right? Like, I don't think his parents knew him this well. I don't think he had this kind of relationship to anyone. Delilah was the person closest to him. He loved her. She knew that he loved her. She knew the moment when his heart was fully open and that he was telling the truth. This is the closest person to him, and she uses it against him. She betrays him. And that's sad. I think we can pity Samson in this moment. I think we are allowed to feel badly, because for all of his failings, I think we can all say that no husband or wife should be betrayed by his or her spouse. That's a sad thing whenever it happens. And so this is a tragic kind of moment where it's revealed that she has nothing for him. It even says that she began to torment him. She never had anything for Samson. No mercy, no hint of compassion or sympathy. It's really sad. Now, Samson, you were a fool to marry her. You did wrong in the eyes of God, and you're in rebellion when you chose her. Yes, is there some sense in which you can't be surprised that this happened to you, Samson, when you chose in this fashion. At the same time, we can't just blame Samson for her sin and how evil she was. Truly, she was evil to do such a thing. Now his hair gets cut off. Said his hair was in 7 locks, because of course it starts getting long. Maybe he had something like what we see like dreadlocks, or maybe he just had to kind of weave it fairly tightly in these 7 locks. In any case, they are shaved off. Now, Samson's hair is symbolic of Samson's power, but where does his strength really come from? It comes from God. So what's really happening here is not that Samson has revealed his weakness, like Achilles divulging, my only weak spot is my heel. That's not really what's happening here. We're not talking about magical hair or anything like that. When Samson told Delilah the truth behind his power and his hair, really, Samson was acknowledging that he had been, and even at that moment was, sinning against the vow that he was under as a Nazirite and as an Israelite. Him telling her that he was under a Nazirite vow to God and the real truth of the matter was for him to acknowledge that he was betraying his calling, failing his parents who in their faithfulness raised him up, and ultimately denying God. So him admitting this, or him saying, I'm a Nazirite under God's vow, think about it. He's acknowledging that he is not acting the way he should be acting. He's not doing what he was called to do, and he knows it. It was an admission of his failures. It was an admission of falling short. Is an admission that the one being betrayed here is not Samson by Delilah. The one being betrayed here is God by Samson, right? And that's what he's admitting to when he reveals this. It's not about, I'm telling you my weak spot. If you just press here, I'll crumple, I'll buckle. Like a boxer who's telling his buddy that he's got to tell when he's going to throw a hook, right? And that guy tells another boxer. So yeah, if you watch the hook, you can see the tell. You'll be able to hit him. It's not like a tactic being revealed, or shortcoming. What is being revealed and admitted to here, what the symbol of his hair represents, it's all saying in his humiliation and in his shame and his hair being cut off, shaved off, is Samson. So you can't claim ignorance. You know what you're doing here is wrong. And now that you finally admitted it to Delilah, that you are supposed to be the judge, you're supposed to be the hero of the story, now, your weakness your shame is revealed. And the power from the Lord will leave you. And of course, they torture him. They take him back to Gaza. They gouge his eyes out. They shackle him with bronze shackles. They force him to do heavy labor. We'll see later they kind of mock him and make fun of him. But we have this little glimmer of hope. The hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. It's not about the hair. It is, but it isn't. It's a symbol that God was still working, that perhaps here, starting again, right? You're not supposed to cut your hair as a Nazirite. You would end your Nazirite vow by getting your hair cut, but he was under a lifelong, since he was born, Nazirite vow. For him to get his hair cut off is like dying. But his hair growing back again is kind of like resurrection, being born again. And this is where I think we see why Samson is in the Hall of Faith, right? In Hebrews 11, Samson is right there. Now, there's not a whole lot that he's done so far that hasn't been mixed. Like, that was good, but then this was sort of bad. But I think here is what earns him, if you can use the word earn. It's not that he earned it, God did it, but that place there is that he was humbled. I think he was humbled. God showed him mercy, and his hair grew again. It's just a sign of God's favor on him, but I think also of Samson's own heart being somewhat changed here. Now, we will get to the rest of this next time we're together. Applications. There's a lot of good quotes when it comes to this chapter, so I almost had a quote fest, and then I just got to have a few here, so I just have had a few. But I like this one by Warren Wiersbe. In terms of application, he says, it's possible for people's character to deteriorate so much that they don't have to be tempted in order to sin. All they need is the opportunity to sin, and they'll tempt themselves. It's a kind of an interesting little twist on it. Look, you can try to avoid certain sins and temptations, as you should. But there are times where you're living in a sin-cursed world where you will be faced with temptations. Even Jesus says so, and Paul and the apostles, I mean, they know that there's times you're going to face temptation. Say you're fasting, right? You're trying to avoid food, but if a friend unknowingly comes over and brings some delicious fast food home, you're tempted. You just live in a sin-cursed world. You don't know everything, and you try to do everything right, and temptation has come to you. But there's a point you can get to where even Christians, and you sometimes wonder whether they're Christians, but they almost see it as a sign from God to sin just because a temptation is there. Like, God, if you really didn't want me to lust, then why did I, drive past a billboard, with some scantily clad woman? Like, you could have prevented me from seeing it, so since I did see it, well, I guess that means you just want me to fall into sin. But it's a heart that wants to sin anyway, that tempts itself. And the further you kind of get away from the Lord and his people and his word, the more you'll go from just being tempted by sin to seeing opportunities to sin. It seems like Samson may have been there as we talk about Judges chapter 16. If you're a Christian, going through this, I was very convicted. I was thinking, are there little areas in my life where I'm letting a wedge in for sin? And of course there are. What am I doing about that? What's my attitude about that? Is that just in the category of things God doesn't care about as much? Versus, well, I'm a faithful husband, and I try to do what I can for the church. So does God really care about what happens in this 5 minutes of my entire week? Am I making categories like that? So appropriate that the prayer time today was a confession. To ask God to really reveal to you those things where you've made just these subtle categories like that, I think is important. Or to ask whether you are just looking for opportunities to sin and seeing that you will tempt yourself. If you're not a Christian this evening, I'm sure you know what it's like to be tempted and to fall, what it's like to be betrayed and to betray other people. If you're older than 7 years old, you've probably experienced some of these things. And I want to tell you, that's not God's design. Again, it's tragic that Samson was betrayed by Delilah. Yes, he picked a Philistine woman he should not have married, but at the same time, it doesn't mean he deserved to be so horribly betrayed. We've all been betrayed and hurt, and there are so many times when we've been the betrayer and the hurter. It's a sin-cursed world we live in. And there's no escape from it, aside from one, which is to place your faith and hope in the sinless one, who was in every way tempted and yet without sin. One of the reasons Jesus Christ came is to give us that testimony and witness that if you are God, you can be without sin. And if you want to be with God, you must be without sin. But the gospel is that you cannot earn that for yourself, and so God offers this gracious deal that if you believe that Jesus died for your sin, you can have his innocence, his righteousness, his perfection granted to you in exchange for your imperfection, for your sin, for your foolishness, for your tainted heart. If you have any questions about what that means, please come talk to me. I'd love to talk to you about that. Talk to someone you know that knows Jesus and ask questions. But I beg you, turn from your sin, embrace the Savior, because the consequence for the sin is judgment and punishment. God is good. He must punish it all, but he offers to spare you through Christ. So turn to him.